so excited to have Stephanie Burton from Adobe here to talk about identity stitching, something super important. And this will kind of lean more into AEP CJA solutions rather than just strictly Adobe Analytics, but the future is now when it comes to those solutions. So we will, certainly be spending time with those solutions in addition to traditional Adobe Analytics. So, and just a reminder about our user group house rules. We want to make sure this is a safe space for members to learn, network, and problem solve. So we ask that you do not do any self-promotion or pitching of any kind. Don't contact people outside of the user group without their consent. And, if members share their use case at a user group, consider it confidential and don't share that information outside of here. So I think we've got 56 people. So Stephanie, if you want to go ahead and get started, I will say we will have time for Q&A at the end. You can please type things in chat, and then we can also have maybe some time to actually chat at the end as well. So Stephanie, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Gretchen. So as Gretchen mentioned, my name is Stephanie Burton, and I am an expert solutions consultant here at Adobe, focusing on data and insights. So that's Adobe Analytics, Customer Journey Analytics, and Adobe Mix Modeler. So today we're going to talk about identity stitching and identity resolution. And so, like she said, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible at the end of the session. A little bit about me real quick. I've been with Adobe for 13 years. But I've been in this industry for a little over 20 years. I actually started on the client side as well in the travel industry, and then made my way over to Adobe and worked for about 11 years in the consulting side. So I'm sure I've probably worked with many of you on the line as well. And now I'm on the pre-sales side for solutioning. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so before we actually get into the demo of how identity stitching works, let's first level set on what it is and why we use it. You may have heard the term identity resolution, right? Well, identity resolution is really the discipline of taking in data across channels and devices and defining which values are considered an identity. That's just a means for recognizing your customer. Now, those identity fields then get put into some sort of a graph for every customer, right? Many customers, many of you are probably already using a graph of some sort. You may have your own graph stood up and in place. Now, if there are IDs that are already in existence that are deterministic, great. We can actually pull that into Adobe as well as a data source, especially if they're not probabilistic. So one thing to consider about partner IDs is that if you are leveraging partner IDs in your own efforts for identity resolution, like I said, we can ingest those as a data source into platform to help support the graph, the identity graph in there. But I would encourage you to be careful and really think through partner IDs on a case-by-case basis, because some companies have deterministic and probabilistic options. Some of them may just have probabilistic IDs. And what happens is a probabilistic ID is going to change over time, right? It can change, it can shift. And when that happens, it's going to cause your graph to collapse, right? And we don't want that to happen. So that's why I try to steer clear of those IDs. But again, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. We do have clients that are sending in partner IDs as part of their own identity resolution in place. Now, identity stitching is a process, right? It's a little different from resolution. Stitching is an actual process that we use for customer journey analytics, where we take the information from the identity graph and use that to help fill in the gaps and allow us more ways to recognize a customer across different channels. So that in turn is going to make it easier for us to bring more sources of data together. It's going to let us more fully connect our customer's journey across as many touch points as possible, for that true omni-channel view of what our customer is experiencing, right? What they're doing. I'm going to walk you through that process from end to end, but a few things that I want to call out about the stitching process first that are kind of unique here are down here across the bottom of the slide. So one of them being live stitching. Okay, so as data comes in, that graph is constantly getting updated and referenced for every event row to look for the best ID available to help connect your data. Okay, so it's stitching live as data comes in. We also have this replay of historical data. This is huge. This means that as customers become authenticated or recognized across any channel, we can actually rekey historical data that we know about that customer, right? And we can start to connect both their pre-authenticated activity with their post-authenticated activity. I kind of like to think of this as like a backwards persistence of sorts. Again, I'll go through an example of how that works as well. And then we can also backfill, or rather hydrate, that graph with existing data. Several of you may be using a graph already if you've got CDP or AJO. Maybe you're just using CJA and you don't have a graph stood up yet. We can take the existing data that you have and use that to help hydrate the graph and start getting those connections in place. And then, of course, this also complies with the governance and privacy policies that are set up across platform, right? So if you have dual labels in there, or if you need to remove identities for any reason, all of those policies that you have in place are adherent to identity stitching as well. Okay, so let's get into it. There are two different ways that we can use stitching to help unify our data, field-based and graph-based stitching. So we're actually going to start with field-based. You may have heard this called CCA, which stands for cross-channel analysis. It's the same thing. It's just some reference it as field-based, some reference it as CCA. So if you already use CJA, this probably looks pretty familiar to you, right? This interface. This is an example of a connection where we are trying to unify different sources of data for each person by timestamp. And that means in the order of occurrence that each event happens. Now we do that using a person identity, right? A common person ID. We are relying on that one common ID to exist across every one of those data sources to make that unification happen. And the preview looks something like this, where every color-coded data set here on the left should have the same color show up under that person ID column to show that we're passing in that same person ID value here on the right, okay? Now, sometimes we may have a data source that needs a little bit more intervention to get there. And one of our biggest challenges is with digital data, right? Because oftentimes in those instances, we might only have a cookie ID, okay? People are not always authenticating, right? And telling us who they are, especially not right away. So if we were to use that cookie ID as our person ID to connect with other sources of data, well, we're limiting ourselves, right? Because we can't connect to any other offline sources of data using our cookie ID. We can't pull in transactional data from a store or branch data from a bank, right? There would be no way to tie that to a cookie ID. And this, we would only have one color show up in that connection preview column. Now, if we were to use the person ID, let's say in this example, it's called a customer ID, we would miss a huge chunk of information and insights, right? All of that unauthenticated traffic and all of that activity would be missing from our connection. It would be missing from our analysis, right? And that's really problematic because that's going to tell us a lot about our customer experience. So for the best of both worlds, we use this process called field-based stitching. Now, when a data set gets stitched, a duplicate copy of that data set is actually created, but it has this new column added called the stitched ID. Now, this column is actually going to hold the value that we use to connect with all those other sources of data, right? So this stitched ID now becomes our person ID in that colorful connection preview. So in that column, we're actually going to apply the best available ID at the time, right? And that's probably going to be your most persistent ID, the one that's going to show up on every row by default, right? And in this case, that's our cookie ID if we're talking about digital data. Now, until an authentication occurs, right? Then once that authentication occurs and somebody logs in, we're actually going to switch, and now we have that new login value as into our stitched ID column, right? And then we can start using that customer ID for connecting data going forward, right? Now, remember we talked a little bit about that rekeying of historical data, right? That's a big one. This is where that happens, because once the authentication occurs, we actually use what's called a replay window for going back and rekeying all of the previous hits or the previous historic events up to a certain point with the now known customer ID. So in this case, we see that ECID 123 has logged in as Bob, and now we can look back, let's say 7 days, and take all of the ECID 123 events and relabel them as Bob, because we now know that that's actually his activity. There are a couple of different replay options. You can either look back 24 hours on a daily basis, or you can look back 1 week. Every week, you could look back 7 days. And then some of our higher SKUs actually have introduced a 14-day look back on a weekly basis and a 30-day look back on a weekly basis. Okay. The other benefit about field-based stitching is that it is ideal for shared devices. Now, what happens when someone else uses your device, right? Let's say that your cookie ID is going to be the same, but now you have a new customer ID attached to that cookie. Let's say you and your spouse maybe share a computer at home, or you have a teenager that uses your phone to log in and make a purchase. What does that look like in the data? Well, you had your original data set that you fed into the AEP data lake, right? And when you did that, you determined what your persistent ID and your transient IDs would be. Remember which one is going to show up on every row and be the most persistent versus which one is going to be the authenticated ID that shows up sometimes. So once you pull those in as identities, field-based stitching is actually going to create this mapping table, right, of those IDs. And the most important part about this mapping table is the timestamps, right? Those timestamps become available in this mapping table. And so now when we get our copy of that data set returned, right, the stitched copy from the original, we have that new stitched ID field that contains the persistent ID, right, until the authentication happens. But now we're able to define when we should switch that ID, right? So for this case, so far, we're just looking at Bob. So it's pretty easy, right? We've got ECID 123 as Bob. He logs in. Great. We know it's Bob going forward. We look back 7 days, right? And we say, okay, well, all of the ECID 123s must be Bob because he just logged in, okay? But now Sue comes along as Bob's wife, and she starts borrowing his computer, right? And this is where the timestamp in that mapping table becomes really important, because this is how we're going to handle those instances where a single device can be used by multiple people over time. So if someone comes in with the same cookie ID, but a new authenticated ID, it's actually going to use the timestamp to make sure that it's only going to update the unauthenticated rows and not overwrite the prior authentication. So that means when Bob's wife comes in and logs on to his computer, it's only going to update the stitched ID value in that column for Sue's events going forward, right? It's not going to replace any of Bob's data in the past because Bob has already showed up as an authenticated ID in that column, so we're not going to replace him. Now, Bob will have to log in again because otherwise all of his future anonymous activity will look like Sue. Right? It'll get attached to Sue unless he logs in again. All right, my clicker is running a little slow here. There we go. So our end goal of being able to use that authenticated ID to connect with other data sources is solved, right? Because now these connections, these data sets that you see in red are going to work. They're allowing us to tie our offline event data sources to our online data source using the person ID, but we still get all of that unauthenticated cookie ID traffic as well. So here's an example of a real data set, right? A real digital data set where we can look at what's happening. If you can see here on the left, we have our person ID is our loyalty ID, and then we have our ECID. But there are several rows here without a loyalty ID at all, right? But that's what we need to be able to connect to our offline data sets. So we're going to turn on field-based stitching, and we're going to get that copy of a data set returned. And we're going to have these two new columns added, the stitched ID value and the stitched ID namespace, which just tells us what type of ID is in that column. And then once our user authenticates, that loyalty ID that's present is passed into the stitched ID column. But then using that replay window, we're able to look backwards and re-key all of those pre-authenticated hits with our loyalty ID now, right, within that 7-day look back window. With the exception of this one person near the bottom who never logged in to begin with. So he's just going to still persist as his cookie ID, right? That's the only way for us to recognize him. A couple of things I want to call out about field-based stitching are that this process relies on that authentication to happen in this one channel, right? It is relying on the IDs that are available within this data set itself, right? So we're going to come back to that when we get to the next phase of stitching. But what is the impact that this has on your data, right? Why does this matter? Well, initially about half of my records were tied to a loyalty ID, right? And you can kind of eyeball that here because if you look at the preview of the data set on the right, you can see that only about half of the rows have the loyalty ID column filled in, right? So that makes sense. But once we apply field-based stitching, we're able to increase our identification rate of those events to almost 92% of customer events being tied to a loyalty ID, right? That's a pretty significant improvement. So this is getting us a lot closer to being able to connect more touch points together for our customer. Now, a few benefits and considerations about field-based stitching. Benefits, right? You get access to both your known and unknown data in your connection. You can unify with other event data sets or even your offline data whenever possible. It's great for supporting shared devices, right? And the attribution is carried across devices and across channels. So if Bob were to search on his desktop, but then go purchase in store, we're able to carry the attribution across from that search that drove his purchase in store. The restatement of historical data, right? That's a big one, looking backwards and being able to rekey with the proper associated identity as it becomes available. Some things to consider: case sensitivity, right? Everything is case sensitive, so you want to keep that in mind before you submit for the stitching process to be put into play. So in other words, data hygiene is important, right? Something you need to consider. Including having its own field as opposed to the identity map. So what I mean by that is when you are doing this stitching process, you have to define that persistent and transient ID, right? You have to reference a specific field for that ID, right? The cookie ID or the loyalty ID, maybe it's an EVAR that you have or something like that. We can't reference the identity map to do that stitching, right? So especially for those of you that are on WebSTK, this is an important little caveat to make sure that you are passing your ECID into a separate field name as well, right? Because it's going to default into that identity map, but we need it in a separate field if we're going to use it in the stitching process. Now, you can still connect data with the identity map field, right? So when you're building out your connection in CJA and you're selecting how you want data to be connected, the identity map is fine there. It's just the stitching process that we can't reference the identity map to do that stitching yet. It's coming, but it's not there yet. The limited to the identities within the data set, right? You saw how we were limited to the authentication to happen in that same channel, right? In that one data set is where all of our IDs had to surface. Now, that means that I'm assuming every other data set that I want to connect is going to have that same preferred ID, or what we're going to start calling the golden ID, available, right? If I want to use this loyalty ID in my example, every other data set that I pull in is going to have that loyalty ID, right? But in reality, that's not the case. That golden or preferred ID is not going to exist everywhere. And that's where graph-based stitching comes in, okay? So in reality, our data looks a little bit more like this, where we have several data sources with different IDs among them. Maybe there's some overlap here and there, but regardless, there's no one consistent ID that exists across every single source to be unified. So what do you do with those other sources, right? Let's say the ones here that don't have a customer ID, like our survey data or our call center data. How do we pull that in? Well, many organizations right now are using Data Distiller or their own heavy ETL processes to try and get that identity applied, right? They're doing their own match lookup, looking for the identity, bringing it in. That's a big time commitment. That takes a lot of resources. That adds some latency, right? Or we have a lot of customers that just have those data sources on the shelf, right? They're not pulling them in for understanding where they fit in the customer journey, right? They're just kind of shelved, and we'll try to piece it together at some point in time. So how do we get all of this data connected? Well, to demo this, we're actually going to walk through an end-to-end example but first we have to get familiar with the data in our example, right? And as I mentioned, I come from the travel background, so we're going to use travel as our example. But as is the case with every industry, right? In every organization, your customers are engaging with you in several different ways across many different channels, right? So in our example here, we start with our digital data, right? And we have our ECID and our loyalty ID as a way to recognize our customer. Then we also have our call center data, and that's introducing a new way to recognize our customer through their phone number. Then we have our survey data, which is pulling in another way to recognize our customer through their email. Then we have our transactional data, which is pulling together the email and the phone number. And then lastly, in our example, we have this in-flight transaction or in-flight engagements that we're able to track. You may also be pulling in different email sources, right, of your email information here, whether it's campaign or another provider. You might be pulling in your journey data. If you're using AJO, you can pull that data in to connect it as well. And then finally, down here on the bottom, I've got a profile data set where I'm just decorating my customer records with some attributes that I know about them. So I need all of these sources connected, right? I need all of these sources in my CJA connection, but right now, there's no way to do that, right? If you look across that top row, there's no one single ID that lives in every source. So I'm going to need to use that stitched ID column again, but this time I have to reference outside of any one particular data set to get an identity. So how do we do that? Everything starts with data ingestion, right? When you have Adobe Experience Platform, and whether it's CJA, AJO, CDP, any of the other app services that sit on it, you start with data ingestion and you pull all of those data sets into Platform. So you can see an example here with the list of my data sets. Now, as you pull those in, you are also defining what's considered an identity in each one of those data sets, right? So here's the list on my right of all of the different identities that I've been collecting across different data sets and different files. This can be anything custom, standard, you name it, right? I've got phone numbers, I've got emails, I've got hash versions of those, cookie IDs, member ID, loyalty ID, whatever it may be for your organization. Now, those identities are being used to build out a graph for each and every customer, okay? So I'm gonna show you how that graph builds with all of those 5 data sets. We're gonna start here with our web data because we've got this ECID and this loyalty ID tied together. But as I start clicking, you'll see that this little toggle is going to move to the right and start ingesting more data. I'm pulling in my survey data, which introduces that email. Then my call center data loads in and brings in the phone number. Then my CRM data comes in and it makes the connection between the phone number and the email, right? So this graph is always updating and always making connections of those identities as the data is coming in, okay? This is the same graph that is used for CDP and AJO if you're already using those services. So this is helping us get a more consistent view of our customer across all of the solutions. Okay, so now that we have the graph in place, how do we use it to help connect more customer data points together? Well, first we have to decide what to connect, right?
Stephanie, this is Gretchen. We just have a couple of questions, and one I wanted to get into you earlier rather than later, but can you just explain the differences in these IDs, the ECID, cookie ID, persistent ID, customer ID, and stitched ID? Just there's so many IDs, people are losing track of their IDs.
Yes. Okay. So think of it first. The stitched ID, when you apply to have a data set stitched, you submit two IDs, a persistent ID and a transient ID. Those are just placeholders for which ID is my lookup value that is going to show up on every row. Which ID do I want to have if it's available, right? So within that, category or that qualification, you would pick whatever ID you have in your data source. So if you're passing in digital data, you probably have a cookie ID. Maybe you have a login ID. You can call that whatever you want, right? If you are passing in call center data, you probably have a phone number as an ID. If you're passing in transactional data, you probably have a credit card number as an ID, or all other ways to recognize who your customer is, right? So there's all different types of IDs in different data sets. It just depends on which data set you're looking at and what you use to identify your customer, right? The transient and persistent ID are just used to help us know which ID are we going to use to go look in the graph, right? Which is our reference point, and which one do we want to return if it's available. Does that help? It took me a long time to get on board with persistent and transient, so I get it.
Yes, so many IDs.
Yeah. Any other questions before I move forward?
One more question. Okay.
Just one other quick question, because you talked about the replay window of 1 day and 7 day.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean it runs each day and again after 7 days?
If you have the 1 day replay, it will run daily. If you have the 7 day replay, it runs every 7 days, or it runs once a week, right? Every 7 days, it looks back 7 days.
So can you have both, or just one or the other?
Depending on your contract, right?
Okay.
So there's room to have both if your use case warrants that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions, Gretchen? Sorry, I can't see the chat.
Nope, that's all for now. But we will
track the questions for you, Stephanie.
Oh, sorry. What was that?
We'll track the questions for you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and move on with how we are going to build our connection. So first, we need to decide what data we want to connect and how we're going to connect it, right? What is that person ID that's going to anchor everything together? So again, I'm going to call that my golden ID or my preferred ID. In this example, I'm going to use email. Why am I using email? Well, it's my most ubiquitous, right? It's the one that exists the most across all of these little data sets. And it's my most reliable and my most durable ID that I have. So how do you know which ID to use, right? You need to think through your first party data strategy, and you need to look at all of the sources of data that you want to connect together to understand the customer experience. And you need to think through what identities you have available, what percentage of your data has that ID that exists, right? Which is the most ubiquitous, which is a durable ID that's not going to change, things like that. And that's going to help you understand which ID you should be using as that connection anchor, right? The thing that you're going to use to marry all this data together. So here I'm going to use email. And now that I've decided I want to connect everything with email, I need to decide which of these data sets I'm trying to pull in, right? Well, we went through those 5 data sets in our example, right? And I want to pull all of them together. So 3 of them have an email column, right? That's great because I can connect those no problem because they all have the email available. But 2 of them don't. 2 of them don't have that ID at all. So really, how am I going to put those in this connection if there's no way to connect without an email? So I'm going to leverage the information that we have in this graph that we just built to help fill in the gaps on those data sets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of those 2 data sets and I'm going to submit them to be stitched, just the same way that I did for field-based stitching. I'm going to get a copy of that data set created, and it's going to have those 2 new columns added. And it's going to use the identifiers here to look for a match in the graph. So if you remember with field-based stitching, we used the identities we had in the data set, and we looked in the data set to see if there was a match. Here we're using the ID we have in the data set, and we're looking over here at the graph and saying, okay, is there a match, right? So for example, in my digital data, I don't have an email, but I have an ECID. So let me take my ECID, which I'm going to say is my persistent, and I'm going to go look to the graph, and I'm going to say, is there a transient ID in here that's an email? And if there is, great, send me back the email. If not, fine, I'll keep the ECID until an email becomes available, right? Now the association has to exist in the graph for that to work. So now I'm going to use that new copy of the data set, and let's see, okay, make sure I'm on the right slide here. Yeah, so I'm going to use the new copy of the data set and with the stitched ID value as my person ID. Okay, so now I have a way to connect all of that data together by email without missing any rows that maybe don't have an email yet, right? Now, the beauty about this is that the authentication can happen in any source, right? As long as the association shows up in the graph-based stitching will pick it up. So that means if maybe the person never logged in on the website, right? Maybe they never did, but they submitted a survey, and now I have their email from the survey, and it's tied to a cookie ID, right? And now that same cookie ID is on the web, and so now I'm able to make those connections, right? So again, as long as the ID gets put in the graph and it makes a connection there, I can leverage it. Okay, so what does this look like when you stand up CJA in the UI? We create our connection, but here you can see on the left, I'm pulling in my 3 data sets that have the email present, right? I've got my CRM data, my survey data, and my CPAC data that all have an email. And so if you look on the right, you can see that my person ID is the hashed email. That's what I want to use to join my data together. But over here, now you see my call center data and my web data. I'm pulling in that stitched copy, not the original, the stitched copy. And instead of picking email, I'm actually picking the stitched ID value in order to connect all of this data together, right? In the correct order by person and so on. So that way, if there's an email that shows up in that stitched ID column, it's going to connect with the other data. If there's not an email available, I'll still have that data. It's just going to show up via a phone number for call center, or it's going to show up with an ECID if it's coming from web. So if we take a closer look at one of our data sets, the same one we looked at for field-based stitching with our digital example, we have our 2 ECIDs, or our 2 IDs, right? Our ECID and our loyalty ID, which is our login online. And this is our most persistent and reliable ID is the ECID. So I'm going to use that value as my lookup, right? My persistent value that shows up on every row, and I'm going to go look up in the graph to see if there's a match. So I go through graph-based stitching, and I get this copy of my data set returned with the new stitched ID column applied, right? Now you can see over here that I'm actually pulling in the email, right? An email that does not already live in this data set at all because it's looking outside of the data set. It's looking in the graph and grabbing that email. Now, if for some reason one of these people did not have an email in their graph yet, it would fall back to the ECID in the same way that our field-based example did. Okay, so what kind of value does this bring to your reporting, right? Well, first is the improved identification rates, right? Now that you can make use of the authentication that happens across any channel, your ability to identify your customers will inevitably go up, right? By how much is largely going to depend on your data, but here in my example, I can show you how I calculate that lift, where I'm going to take all of the events where the email was present, the actual email value was present, and divide that by total events. And then I'm going to take the number of events where that stitched ID was an email divided by all of the events. And that's going to tell me what my lift was compared to before graph-based stitching. So initially, I only had about 30% of my events tied to an email. And that makes sense, right? Because I only had 3 out of 5 data sets that even had that value available. both graph-based stitching, I was able to tie all of my events to an actual email by referencing the graph. So now that we have improved identification rates, we'll take a closer look at the value we unlock in just connecting data sources, right? Before graph-based stitching, I would have only been able to truly connect these three sources together, right? The CRM, CPAC, and survey data, because they're the only ones with an email. But by using the graph, I can truly connect all of my event data from all 5 sources, including the web and call center data here that doesn't even have an email originally in that data set.
Stephanie, two quick questions. Quick. So one question is the historical visitor counts. Will these change or increase as the 2 IDs are merged into the same person?
It will, yeah. Your IDs, your person value may shift as people get recognized and their data gets stitched together.
Okay. And then the second question, I assume this is due to the stitching, but can these be controlled using APIs?
The stitching process, no, but applying data to the graph, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So the whole reason that we want this data combined is to see the connected experience of our customers' touch points, right, across all the channels. So if you guys are familiar with CJA, this is how our data comes in. Our data sets show up with this identifier that's kind of messy, right? It's an alphanumeric string. So I want to clean that up a bit, right? In order to see how my customers are flowing across those sources. This isn't going to tell me much if I just see a bunch of different strings in my, numeric characters in my flow chart. So I'm actually going to use a derived field. There's several ways you can do this, but I like to use the derived field of find and replace, where I'm basically going to say, okay, find me all of the, platform data set IDs of 65A, whatever, and rename that with CPAC data. And I'm just going to give them each a friendly name, right? And so now I can build a flow report with my data sources, and it will actually make sense to me. You might be used to doing something like this with a segment or a filter. Well, the reason we can't do that here is because we can't put segments in our flow chart, right? We can't flow segment by segment. So we need a dimension. And so this is an easy way to do that with derived fields. Okay. So now if you were to look at this in the flow report, before graph-based stitching, this is how our flow would look, right? Those 3 sources. This is difficult. This has a lot of gaps and a lot of breakage points. We see a customer go from a CRM transaction to a survey response. If that survey response is negative, we can't explain why or what happened to make it negative, right? We just see they had a transaction and then, bad sentiment. So what's going on? Or even if it's good, right? We can't tell you what caused a good experience. So we have no idea what our customer is experiencing between these different steps. Again, if we're pulling in all of those sources, right, but we're not using graph-based stitching, we're not truly connecting them all, right? 3 of them are connected, but the others are not because they don't have that email value. So then your journeys are going to start looking like this, right? There's still a lot of breakage. There's a lot of breakage points in the journey, which means you can't find friction points, right? You can't find where there's friction happening. You can't find ways to better optimize the experience or even learn from positive experiences. But then when you apply graph-based stitching and you do get that fully connected journey, fully integrated by timestamp for every person, now your flows start to uncover a lot more, right? Now you can start to see the actual step-by-step events that your customer is experiencing with you across every channel and every touch point that you offer. So now we're able to more accurately identify where the friction is, if there is any. We're able to know where to focus our efforts and really, improve the actual experience for our customers. Okay, so a few benefits and considerations here. The benefits you saw, right? The improved identification rates was a big one. We're able to connect more sources of data together without that heavy lifting or that burdensome ETL process. We're able to fully connect most of, if not all of the customer touch points across channels, which is going to give us more accurate person-based reporting. And we're now in line, right? We're in sync with the way that the other app services are recognizing a person, right? So we have that same understanding of who a person is now across app services. A couple of things to consider. Graph-based stitching does not support shared devices yet. So if field-based stitching, we walked through that example with the mapping table and the timestamp. We don't have that timestamp yet with graph-based stitching. So we are relying on the first lexicon value that gets credit, right? So that's something to consider if you have a lot of shared devices. It hasn't really come up as a major blocker for most of the clients we've worked with thus far, but there are some use cases where you'd want to really consider that. Again, no identity map support, right? So same thing with field-based stitching. You can't connect. You can connect with an identity map, but you can't reference an identity map field for the stitching process yet. So again, just make sure that your identities are in their own field name as well. And then because we're using the user identity service, right, there are some guardrails that we inherit from that. One of them being 50 IDs per graph. So that's kind of just a limitation that you have to consider if you, for some reason, expect a lot of identities for your customer. That's something that you want to think through. And then ideally, you would choose one golden ID or one preferred ID for connecting your data, right? So in my example, I chose email. You would pick whichever one makes the most sense for your organization. So again, the value of graph-based stitching is really to help bring more sources together, sync with the other app services, improve ways of identifying your customers, and just being able to leverage the associations that are made in the graph, and minimizing the extra heavy lifting that it may take to get those associations into your data. One thing we cannot do is we cannot take an ID and go out on the internet and find it. Go out on the ether and find that customer, right? So these identities and these associations, they have to live in your graph, right? They have to exist from your data. We can't take an identity and then go find it somewhere else for you, right? So you have to have it in existing in the graph. And with that kind of brings me to the end of the majority of the content. If we've got a few more minutes, I think about 15 minutes to go over more questions.
Sure. So we have 3 outstanding questions.
Okay.
The first one is, how does field-based stitching based on individual impact the concept of the same information for an org ID?
Sorry, how does field-based stitching what?
How does field-based stitching based on individuals impact the concept of the same information for an org ID?
The same information for an org ID. Let me see. How does field-based stitching based on the impact the concept?
Yeah, Damon, do you want to add some context to your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Are you referring to like the Adobe org ID, or are you referring to like a B2B situation?
Yeah, like a B2B situation. So if you're trying to get an understanding collectively on engagement from an organization, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Are there considerations as we are getting all this information for individuals? Are there considerations or learnings that you have associated with how to apply the different stages an organization is going through?
Yeah, so that's kind of a loaded question. So CJA in itself is, originally it wasn't really ideal for B2B, right? It was really a B2C setup, but over the past couple of years, they've been making major innovation changes to make it B2B worthy, right? To make it satisfy B2B. So there's a lot of improvements that have been made. I will say, and I can't speak to all of those right now because I'm not the B2B SME, subject matter expert, but I will say when I was in consulting and we came across this situation, what we would do is we would have 2 different connections. One would be based on the person ID, and then we'd have a different connection that was based on the account ID, right? And the key there being that you really want to be careful in terms of attribution, right? Because if you're thinking about attribution, it can get kind of messy if you're rolling up to the account level, right? See, somebody reached out to me as an Adobe employee, and then I passed it off to my boss, and then she ended up making, a transaction or, service transaction. Now it kind of gets messy in the attribution, right? It looks like she didn't have any campaign or effort, but I did, right? So depending on the use case, you could have separate connections for that.
I heard also rumors, at least from a roadmap standpoint, that there's some sort of answer associated with the org ID coming out later this year. Is there a place to look at that roadmap where we can see those type of updates that are coming?
I think an Experience League is going to be your best bet to try to find that. Yeah, they keep their roadmap pretty tight-lipped, even from us. So.
Okay, all right. Then I'm not sure where I heard that from, and I don't know who.
Yeah, don't run them out.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Okay. The second question is, does either stitching process setup require Adobe support to configure, or are we able to set up either of these on our own?
Yeah, so right now it does require submitting a customer care ticket to have that stitching process put in place. So what that means is you submit to customer care, I want to get this data set stitched using field-based or graph-based, and then they will ask you, what's your persistent ID, what's your transient ID, what's your replay window, things like that. And then you'll fill that out, and then Adobe will do all of the process for putting that in place. In the future, we are working on something in the UI so that it is a lot more self-serve, but we're not quite there yet. And also, it will be dependent on your SKU, right? Because different levels of CJA have different amounts of what they can do, right? Like certain levels have graph-based stitching or field-based stitching. Other levels of SKU may only have field-based stitching. Some may have a 30-day look-back option. Another one might only have 14, 7, and 1, right? So it kind of depends on where you're at there.
When you're going through the friction after the graph stitching, question is, how are you identifying friction after graph stitching?
How am I identifying friction after graph-based stitching?
Yes.
Well, I think that's just any friction, right? If you're looking at a fallout report, right, and you expect your customer to move through a particular flow and they're not moving through it as expected, that may indicate friction. If you have KPIs that are trending downward, that may indicate friction in the path, right? So any type of analysis that you typically use to uncover areas of friction, that's what you do here. It's just that you have more touch points included, right? So you can refine where that friction might be happening a lot better than if you only had a few data sources, right? What I was showing in the flow report was just the connection of those sources, right? So that you can see, okay, if I do have friction somewhere, I'm going to be able to see a lot better in my analysis where that might be happening now that I can see all of the data.
Okay. And I think that's all for our, I see Jonathan with his hand up.
Yeah. Hey, Stephanie, thank you. This was awesome. Awesome presentation. So I think you touched on this just a few minutes ago. But I am curious about the licensing, how that works. Are you able to answer any questions about, like, I don't know, is it available? Are either of these solutions available as like an add-on? If, let's say they've already purchased.
Yeah, so it's not available as an add-on. It's available through the different levels, right? So there are 4 levels. There's CJA Foundational, Select, Prime, and Ultimate, right? Foundations, you don't have any stitching. Select, you have field-based stitching with the 1-day or 7-day replay.
Okay.
Prime, you have graph-based or field-based stitching with a 1, 7, or 14-day replay. And then Ultimate, you have graph-based or field-based stitching with a 1, 7, 14, or 30-day look back. Now you may use both, right? You might have one data set that's using field-based stitching and another data set that's using graph-based stitching. And then you also have some licensing requirements on how many data sets can be stitched, right? So I think one of them has like 10 data sets can be stitched. Another one has 50 data sets that can be stitched. It's rare that you would need that many data sets stitched. Usually it's like less than 5.
Gotcha. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Some questions are coming in. So one is, these 2 types of stitching impact how AEP data sets are connected in CJA. Would you mind talking about any impacts to profiles when using either of the stitching methods?
Right. So So we're not touching the profile at all. Okay. So the identity graph and the profile they work in tandem, but we're not doing anything with the profile itself. We are just referencing the information in the graph. The only reason why it may be a consideration of impacting anything going on with profile is if we start passing in more identities to that graph that we need for CJA that maybe you don't have in there yet, right? That's something where we would want to, you would want to work with your CDP team or your RT CDP team or your AGO team to make sure, hey, if we pump this information into the graph, is that going to affect you and what you're doing? Most of the case, probably not, but it's always good to make sure you're on the same page. The other thing I do want to tell you about that is you might be familiar with when you're setting up your data and you click on the little toggle, right? When you're pulling in your data set and you click on the toggle that says enable for profile, that's how you get the data into the graph and the profile. There's a way through API to just get it into the graph without getting it into profile. So there are some ways to try to avoid any sort of interference on that.
Okay. 2 more questions. They're coming in. How does CJA ID stitching differ from AEP ID stitching?
So AEP does not do ID stitching. AEP does more identity resolution, right? It's building the graph, right? And remember, the graph is just what we use as a reference point for the stitching process.
Okay. 1 more question. If we are not stitching data sets and we are having multiple properties conform to one data set, is only the CJA stitching needed and is support required for this?
So if you're not stitching data sets and you have multiple properties conform to one data set, is CJA okay? So the only reason why you would need stitching is if you're trying to combine data sets and you don't have a way to connect them, right? If let's say you have a data set and there's no ID available to connect with your other properties of data, then you would want to consider stitching. Again, if you have the IDs available in a graph. A lot of times we will have customers who, I've talked to customers who are interested in graph-based stitching, but they only have one data set that needs to be stitched, and the ID that they need is coming in through the authentication in that same channel. So in that situation, field-based stitching is still going to be what you need. Now, if you have another data set that you want to pull in and it doesn't have that ID, then you need to use the graph to try and fill in the gap. So it largely depends on, as long as you have the IDs you need to connect your data, then you don't need to turn on stitching.
A follow-up question to that is, so the only function in CJA derived field for replacing for backfilling replace is what would be necessary? Can you expand on that, Josh?
Yeah, so if we're using the ECID as our persistent ID and a customer ID is the transient ID, and if we're having our different properties conform to one schema data set, and then that data is going to be passed into CJA, and we're wanting to, once users authenticate and we have their customer ID, we want to backfill all of those person ID values. It seems like the stitching in the AEP piece may not be necessary if we have the fields we need, and then we just backfill with the CJA function for replacing in the directive.
So you would need the field-based stitching.
Okay.
The field-based stitching is where you would get the replay for the same identity that happens right in that one data set. They authenticate, you want to backfill the rows that exist without the authentication. Field-based stitching is what you need.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, that was a lot of great questions. So thank you. This is a topic everyone was interested in. So thank you, Stephanie.
So I just want to make sure for everybody, we covered all the outstanding questions.
I think we did.
Yes.
So
Jonathan.
yeah, so thank you everyone for coming, and we'll have, I think, try and do one more session before the end of the year for the central user group. So stay tuned for details on that. So,
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting
thank
me.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.